Olá, aqui é Frank Florida com mais uma entrevista poliglota para o Farol da Fluência. E hoje vou entrevistar uma amiga minha que vem de um desses países que às vezes menciono, onde praticamente todo mundo fala vários idiomas e acha a coisa mais normal do mundo. E além disso, ela também aprendeu algumas línguas a mais. Então é um caso interessante porque ela une os dois lados da moeda, né? Ela já cresceu com vários idiomas e vem de um país onde ninguém vai numa escola para aprender inglês, todo mundo fala inglês. E ao mesmo tempo, ela aprendeu outros idiomas por iniciativa própria, né? Realmente aprendendo conscientemente. Então agora eu vou trocar para o inglês e welcome, Stephanie.
Hi.
All right, so I just told my students that the reason why I wanted to interview you is because you come from a country, from the Philippines, where basically everybody speaks several languages, right? There's basically nobody who doesn't speak at least 2 languages, if not 3 or more. Can you just tell my students in Brazil a little bit about that? Because in Brazil, maybe 95% of people speak only Portuguese and maybe a little bit English, but most people are not fluent in more than 1 language.
Well, it also comes from the fact that the Philippines is made up of several different islands. So being separated from each other, each island got to develop their own languages. So like for Cebu alone, we have our Bisaya language or the Cebuano language. And then once you go further up north, where Manila, where the capital is, then it's Tagalog, or what they call as Filipino. So those 2 alone, but still, for us to learn Tagalog, there's a bit of a disparity because some people, well, the ones from Manila tend to look down if they hear people talking in Cebuano, and we don't want to use the national language. So typically we'd speak to each other as much as possible in English. So at least those would be the basic languages that each person would have to learn. Coming from a Chinese descent, that's how I came to know about speaking Chinese also.
Right, so basically you grew up with 4 languages, that's just what you came from the factory with. No?
Yes, that's right.
Okay, that's fantastic. And then on top of those 4, you also learned further languages on your own initiative, is that right?
Yes, I became interested in Japanese language because I always watch anime. And the first releases are always in Japanese. In the beginning, I was watching the shows with English subtitles, but there are times that the story is getting very exciting or very thrilling, and I can't wait for the translation. So I ended up learning another language as well.
All right, interesting. Yeah, I know a lot of countries in Asia have mixed people from mixed origins, and then they end up speaking whatever country their family came from, plus all the languages that are commonly spoken in the place where they reside. But the Philippines are interesting because, like you said, there is 2 major languages, right, already in the country, plus English. And in fact, English here is so good that American companies now hire Filipinos to work for them and handle phone services because Americans confuse Filipinos for native speakers, right? Can you tell us a little bit about how people learn English in the Philippines?
Well, I guess it's also more of exposure. Our shows, our textbooks. If you go to school, all the books, and even the the mode of instruction are all in English, except for a specific subject, which is Filipino, and it's spoken in Tagalog usually.
Okay, so basically people speak Tagalog at home or Cebuano, and then they speak English at school?
For us in Cebu, we don't speak Tagalog at home.
Right.
We speak Cebuano. It's only when there are some shows, like Tagalog shows, that we see on TV. And then the rest, well, the movies, as what you can see from our cinemas, they're all mostly in English.
Okay, so basically the answer is immersion, right?
Yes.
You don't actually you study Filipino as if it was the foreign language, and
Yes.
English is the one that you always have around you just 24/7.
Yes, that's right.
All right, that's interesting. And how big are the differences between Tagalog and Cebuano and other Filipino dialects?
Very big differences. Although we also have certain similar words, but some words, like for example, the word langgam, in Tagalog, it's called, in Tagalog, it means ants. In Cebuano language, it means a bird.
Okay.
Completely different.
Interesting. So it's really different languages. It's not just a small variation on a theme.
Yeah. Well, there are some words with a slight similarity, but some are completely different.
Okay. So one of the reasons I'm interviewing you and, people who speak a lot of languages is just to show what's possible and that the human brain is really wired to learn languages, right? Because in Brazil, people usually go to school for about 5 years and most of them still don't speak fluently in English after 5 years, and they spend a lot of money and a lot of time, and they're frustrated because they're still afraid to speak. They're afraid to make a mistake, and so they just prefer to not say anything. And in other places, people grow up with, in your case, 4 really distinct languages, very different from each other, right? So that just goes to show what the human brain really is capable of, and that learning a language is not rocket science, right? It's really something very natural. And in your case, just by immersion alone, even though you don't live in the US, but you just have that immersion despite being here, because everyone speaks English, you watch your movies in English, you read your books in English, that immersion alone creates the necessary learning environment, right?
Yes, and also to build up the vocabulary, because it's different if you have to look at the dictionary each time. And if you read through a story or you see a movie and that word is being used, so you more or less get the context clues.
Right. Just from repetition, the word pops up 20, 30 times after a while. You just can't forget it anymore, right? And then Japanese was the language you learned with a conscious effort, right? That was not something you grew up with.
Yeah, it wasn't something that I grew up with, but mostly I watched the shows for several years.
Okay, so, more immersion.
Yeah, more immersion. So basically, I already knew some of the words. So I only took the class because I know that in Japanese there's a polite way of saying it,
right?
Like a common language. So, and the words that I was learning were coming from ninja movies, from action movies, which are more of the common language, or if not even lower, not respectful.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, the Japanese have completely different ways of speaking depending on how much respect one wants to express when speaking, right? Like, for example, you would address your boss in a completely different way than you would your friend or your family members. And so another theme with all the people I've interviewed is that they don't see languages as a chore. It's not something that, oh my God, I have to do this, I don't want to do this, but it's something that you do because you're curious about it and because it's a passion for you, correct?
Yes, and it also helps you understand. It makes your understanding a bit broader because you can also learn from the language itself, something from the culture.
Right.
Like, for example, how rice is cooked. So in Filipino, there are many ways of saying it because there are many ways of cooking it. Mm-hmm. But in other languages, it might just be to cook rice or,
Right. Okay. And so it's an interesting language to learn, Japanese, because it's pretty complex, right? As opposed to English, which most of my Brazilian students learn English at least first, and some of them go on to learn other languages as well. But when they learn English, they often don't realize how much easier it is than languages in Asia or in Europe, because English doesn't really have much of a grammar. The words all have the same article, right? All the nouns are the, whereas in other languages there could be several different kinds of articles. There is no conjugation. There is no great distinction between direct and indirect object, which completely changes several words in a sentence in German, for example, and so forth. But Japanese is the opposite of that. It's a really complex language, right? So could you tell my students a little bit about how you went about learning the complexities of the Japanese language and the grammar and the structure of the sentences?
Well, first of all, I learned to read and write the 3 different kinds of, because they have, unlike the English alphabet, which is just A, B, C, D, right. They have 3 different kinds, kanji, katakana, and hiragana. Right. So once you learn all the hiragana and katakana, you learn how to pronounce the words, but not really the meaning. So the next step would be to learn more vocabulary. Right. And after that, it was just, well, actually, it was very easy for me to learn Japanese because I know Chinese.
Oh, the kanji are similar to the Chinese symbols, right?
Yes. And then the way, even if I don't know how it's read in Japanese, as long as I read the words, I can understand them already.
Right. So just to clarify, it's just the writing that is similar, right? The pronunciation, the words are actually quite different, right?
Some are similar also.
Oh yeah? What percentage would you say overlap between Chinese and Japanese?
I would say 50%.
50% overlap in the vocabulary?
I think so, but it's either close in the Mandarin language or in the Fujian language or some sort of Chinese dialect.
Ah, I see. That's interesting. Okay, I wasn't even aware of that. The most recent interview I did was with a Senegalese, and he said that he picked up just about a dozen different languages, and many of those are tribal languages in Africa, right? Because you, in every African country, have the official language, and then you usually have English or French, and then you have all the tribal languages, and he would just know maybe 5 or 6 of those, right? And it's probably about the same. Maybe some of the words are similar and some are different. And what about vocabulary? How did you go about learning the Japanese vocab?
Well, one of the teachers lent me the movies that I liked, but without the subtitles, so I was forced to learn.
Oh, without the English subtitles, yeah?
Yes.
Interesting. One thing I always recommend to my students is to watch the movie with subtitles, but subtitles in the language that they're trying to learn, right? So if they want to watch an English movie and learn English, instead of using Portuguese subtitles, they should use English subtitles as well, right? Have you tried that at all, using Japanese subtitles on Japanese movies?
No.
Okay.
Only with Chinese.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And did you write the words down? Did you practice with a book? Did you do exercises, or was it just purely immersion and having fun with the movies?
There was also a point that I went to a school, and one of the things our teacher asked us to do is to write a diary each time.
Oh.
So it could be as short as, oh, today was so tiresome, I did this and that. Not really a long diary, but, 4 or 5 sentences.
Okay,
To
so
get us to practice.
so you're writing sentences from scratch, yeah? And you
Yes.
don't. That's one of the things I always make fun of, because a lot of language courses, not just in Brazil but in the traditional method, they will give you a sentence where there's one word missing, and it's
Multiple choice type.
right. And the problem is it doesn't really prepare you for real life, because you will never be in a situation, if you ever go to Japan, you will never be in a situation where the sentence is already finished and just one word is missing, right?
Yes, that's right. And one thing also is that we were 3 in the class. So our teacher made us read from our diary what we wrote down. And then we wrote it on the board, and she corrected our grammar. And afterwards, should one of the other classmates want to ask questions in Japanese, then we expound on the story. But it's a way of conversation skills also. And that way you can ask your teacher, what's the Japanese word for this one? How do I express this one? Right. And she teaches you. So by the next lesson or by the next conversation, you just end up using the words that you already know and are incorporating new words.
Yeah, certain quality control, right? If you make up your sentences from scratch, you have to
Yes.
check that they're actually correct.
Yeah. Yes. Or it might be in the dictionary, that's the correct meaning, but in actual usage, you should use a different word. That happens a lot.
Okay. What about comprehension? What would you recommend to somebody who's learning a foreign language and just doesn't really understand the native speakers yet because they speak very fast, or because they're not used to the pronunciation yet? How would you go about the first steps to improve listening comprehension?
Watching movies for me, because you get to listen in on how they really speak in actual life events, like as it happens.
Right.
Because usually what you can hear from YouTube or online lessons is that they speak really slowly for you to analyze. But in actual conversations, it's actually faster.
Yeah.
Yeah, or even with some intonation or with some feeling or expression.
Right. That's exactly what I teach as well. Is a lot of the courses are just so far removed from the way people actually speak in real life that it's not very useful. It doesn't actually prepare you for any situation you will actually find yourself in. And what about pronunciation exercises?
Pronunciation, you just try to copy what's being said. Like,
Your imitation, no?
yes, like if there's a word that's being said, oh, that sounds cool. So you try to pause and then try to copy it.
Exactly, yeah, exactly what I recommend. It's funny how, how a lot of people that speak a lot of languages come up with the same techniques, right? It's many paths lead to Rome, but all the paths seem to interject at some points. And let's see, what if you pronounce the word, how do you make sure that you get it right, that the pronunciation is correct? What's your quality control for pronunciation?
Well, in our building now, there are many Japanese. So whenever I try to speak to them, at first they sound surprised, like, oh, you're speaking in Japanese, but they can converse with me, and afterwards they tend to say, oh, it's correct. Like,
nice.
Your Japanese is like a native's.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
so
Yeah.
I think that's enough affirmation for me.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, if you really imitate the sound, like you said, and then you check if if it's correct, if it sounds the same, even yourself, even without a native, you can get pretty close to the original sound, right? Like you're even getting compliments from native speakers that that you sound like them.
It depends because Japanese language is not so strict compared to Chinese language.
Yeah.
In Chinese language, with a slight difference in inflection, intonation, it makes a whole lot of difference on the meaning.
Right.
So it depends on the type of language.
Yeah, Japanese is not a tonal language, and that does make it easier. Okay, that's great advice. Like to just meet native speakers, even if you don't have a chance to travel. I always tell my students to just go to meetup.com or Couchsurfing or meet people in hostels or Airbnb, etc. Right? Just meet native speakers, even if you don't have a chance to travel. Okay, what about conversation and being fluent in a conversation, or the fear of speaking that makes a lot of people freeze up? What do you say to that? What's your advice to someone who has that problem?
Well, first, to make yourself less awkward, you need to practice speaking, even if by yourself, so you can hear your own voice with it and grow more comfortable with your own voice in that language.
Right.
Because I admit, the first time I tried to repeat the Japanese language, for example, I ended up laughing because, it sounds so cartoonish, because my first experience with the Japanese language was with anime.
Right.
So once I got used to it, it just became like a sort of the way you can express yourself.
That's interesting, because I learned all the languages that I learned by myself, sitting at the kitchen table and just speaking the words out loud, and of course, if you don't live alone, people will think you're a little bit crazy because you're talking to yourself. They don't even understand the words, but you have to really get over that shyness and that fear of embarrassing yourself, because it will help you so much. And it's so much less embarrassing than actually speaking to a native speaker and practicing for the first time then, because you haven't had the chance to do that earlier. When you speak in Japanese, are you able to think in Japanese yet? Or do you still think in English and then translate in your mind and then speak in Japanese?
It depends. When I was in Japan last April, I was able to think in Japanese and then ended up translating when I was speaking with my companions how to speak back in English.
Nice.
It depends on the environment I'm in.
Right.
That has a big factor.
Right. But you are able to do that. What got you to that point where your thoughts started to switch in Japanese, where you were able to speak and say something in Japanese without having to think about the meaning in your own language first?
Yeah, but usually just the simple expressions like, oh, this is delicious, or, that's nice, or that's really cool.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what about reading and writing? You already said that you started with the alphabets, with the Japanese alphabets. That's what you learned first. What tips would you give people that, even if it's not a language with a different alphabet, if somebody wanted to learn a foreign language, what tips would you give them about reading and writing?
I think a lot of study would be, depending on the kind of language. If it's English, it's pretty straightforward because it's just the English alphabet. And you just, practice reading. And then it's the difference between reading and writing is that with reading, you can, even if you don't know the word, sometimes you can get the meaning because of the context clues. When it comes to writing, you really dig through your vocabulary system to see what words would be good enough to express what you're trying to say. So I think the reading is a lot easier compared to writing on your own.
Yeah, I agree. I think all, as I call them, the passive abilities, like reading, where you're just taking information in rather than proactively writing it, or even listening to someone speak as opposed to forming your own sentences yourself, they're usually easier, right? Mm-hmm. Because it requires less skill to recognize something than to create it from scratch, right? Yeah, I agree. Any other advice, any other comments for someone who lives in a country where nobody speaks a foreign language, where nobody even can conceive of the idea that you could learn a foreign language without going to school for years and years, and even then still struggle with the language? What kind of mindset shift would you recommend to that person, and what kind of advice would you give someone in that situation?
Well, try to look for things that you like. So it could be comic books, or it could be movies, or just plain conversation. You can actually start practicing the language in the context of an environment that you're already familiar with or are comfortable enough with to make it more interesting.
Yeah, that's great advice. I think if we enjoy something, anything, we'll always be more concentrated than if we struggle because it's a chore, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. I think that just about covers it. Do you have any last words? Any last pieces of advice?
Just have fun.
Just have fun.
Yes.
That's good advice. I like it. All right. Well, thanks a lot, Stephanie, for the interview. And I hope everybody got a lot of value from it and implements your advice and puts it into practice. Thanks a lot.
Okay. Thank you also.
Bye-bye.